Hi, I'm Mandy, and welcome to my very first Skillshare class. For my very first class, I thought I would talk about very basic watercolor techniques. I do a lot of watercolor artwork, so having this video class here is going to make it a lot easier for people to understand how to use watercolors, so they know the techniques I'm talking about in the other projects. So for this class, we are going to be creating a small watercolor landscape using 3 watercolor techniques. There's really only like 3 of them. It's wet on wet, wet on dry, and dry brush, and that's about it. So we're going to use all 3 of them to create this little landscape. Of course, yours will look different because everyone looks different. You'll be able to make your own choices. I want you to kind of follow along with me as I do it, and that will be your project at the end of the Skillshare lesson, is the painting that you create with me, basically. And thanks to Skillshare, you can pause and you can slow down, you can speed up, you can do all that stuff so that you can go at your own pace. So if you need to go faster than I'm going or slower, you can do that, which is awesome. Because sometimes when you're teaching in a real class, it's really hard to make sure that all the kids, you're going the right pace for every student. It's, it's impossible. But anyway, so at the end, you'll have this cool little landscape that you will have painted all on your own. It's sort of like a watercolor Bob Ross, so you'll paint along with me and you'll learn how to do it as we go. So have fun, enjoy the lesson, follow me on social media. I'll put those on the page here. You can keep up on lesson updates or any personal projects that I'm working on. Also, I want to apologize for any bad audio that you might hear. I don't have like a nice microphone, so I'm basically just using the microphone that is on my computer or on the phone. So yeah, just don't mind that, and hopefully we got a good lesson. All right, we'll see you in part 1.
Hello, welcome to part 2. In this section, we're going to talk about supplies and how to prep your paper. Some supplies that you're definitely going to need are watercolor paints, watercolor paper, brushes, water, etc. I put a list in here for you. Some really nice ones to have are masking tape and a pencil. Masking tape comes in handy, but it's not necessary. Alright, here is where the masking tape is going to come in handy. With watercolor paper, when it gets wet, it likes to buckle. Now, sometimes like if you just don't want to worry about this, you don't have to, it's not totally necessary. The buckling can sometimes create weird marks on the paper when the watercolor dries. And it takes a long time to dry as well. So most watercolor artists just simply tape down their paper, and that's all I'm doing in this section. Is I'm just getting a piece of masking tape and I am just taping all 4 sides down to the table, and this really helps with the buckling. Now the paper that I'm using is pretty small. I think it's about a 5 by 7, and this is a good size to start with since we're just going over the basic techniques for this video. So when I tape down, I just like to do about half the tape, or 1/4 of an inch is on the paper, and then the rest of it's on the table. Sometimes you can tape to a board so you can move your painting around. I'm just taping directly to the table. And that's it. Hello, welcome back to part 3. In this section, I'm going to be showing you how to paint a wash as well as how to use the wet on wet technique. Basically, a wash is a really watery mixture of water and your watercolor paint in whatever color you like. It's generally used to cover a large area, which is why we are going to be using it to paint the sky on our landscape. So we're going to cover this whole paper in a light blue wash that will be the sky in our landscape. Here I'm showing you that you can spray your paper and then use your brush to spread your water around. That's the way you can do your wash. Typically I just do a brush with some water on and spread it around until it's wet. You don't want it to be soaking wet, you just want it to be wet enough to make the paint spread around. So here I'm picking blue for our light blue sky, and I'm just going to paint it right across the top. This is how I like to do a wash for a sky. And then here, what I'm doing is I'm pulling down the paint. So the water acts as sort of it'll help blend your paint for you. So if you want like a really nice smooth gradient, what I'm going for is a blue to white, and then I'm going to add a little bit of green in later. But for right now, we're just going to do a blue to white gradient, and this will make a realistic sky. What you want to do is you just kind of want to play around with how dark or how light you want your sky. So here you can see I'm adding some more blue, make it kind of darker at the top, kind of just again pulling it down. You just do this until you're satisfied with how it looks. Here I'm just doing some more blending. And you can, move your brush different directions, kind of like I'm doing. Sometimes I move it up and down, sometimes I go side to side, and really just get it to a point where you are happy with it, and then you can move on to the next step. So bonus technique coming up here is if you want to create the easiest clouds on the planet, you can just wad up a piece of paper towel, and then you just kind of dab away some of the paint. This is called lifting in the watercolor community. So you are lifting away the paint, and this typically only works while the paint is still wet. So you need to, if you want some white fluffy clouds in your painting, you need to make sure that you get in there and lift some of that up. The next thing we're going to paint are going to be our mountains in the background, and we're going to use wet on wet technique because it will create softer looking mountains. So I was just showing you my brush there, so it's a flat brush. I like to use a flat brush to paint mountains. It can make your edges sharper, softer, what have you. So here I'm using a praying palette. Praying is just a really cheap school grade palette, so I'm using the black in the praying palette. And the black in the praying palette isn't black, it's more like a navy kind of color. So, and the reason why this is wet on wet, or paper that's still wet again, and if you do your background details, like mountains for example, when the paper is still wet, it gives it a soft kind of look because the paint is going to want to run where the water is. The paint will go where the water is, which is why the watercolor bleeds. So if you want a set of mountains that looks like they're farther away, you can do mountains in wet on wet, and it just makes them kind of blurry looking, and that implies distance. Leonardo da Vinci said the further away something is, the bluer and the blurrier it will look. So that's, just kind of something cool, random factoid for you right there. So here we're going for some kind of blurry, far away looking mountains. Like maybe they're just kind of misty. It might be, gonna rain later in the day, or I don't know. It's your landscape. As Bob Ross says, it's your world. So you don't want your mountains to be perfect up and down little triangles. That's how 5-year-olds draw mountains. I don't know how old you are if you're watching this. If you're 5, you're going to be the best at painting mountains. I'm assuming you're an adult or a teenager. You want your mountains to look more realistic. Don't paint them as perfect triangles. Just kind of make it up as you go. You can still have peaks and valleys, but just please don't do perfect up and down triangles of varying sizes. So here I'm just going back in with a little bit more paint and just kind of adding in some details while the paint is still wet. I like my watercolors to be, I don't know how to describe this, really, I like wet on wet. That's my favorite technique. So I really love how it blurs together the details. That's how I like my watercolors to look, I guess, is blurry. So here I'm just adding in, kind of trying to add in some details with it. You can do this if you want, or you can just leave one big kind of solid shape like the first thing I have. Still painting. Alright, here we go. So now I'm adding some more water, and I'm doing more of a pull down technique like I was doing with the sky. We're going to paint over the stuff that's kind of at the bottom of the page, so I'm just using the water to sort of help do a background, and I'm going to blend it. So here I'm a little bit off-rate, but I'm using green. I'm just going to kind of create some green looking foothills. So again, we're still using wet on wet. The paper's pretty wet, so I just got some green on my brush, and I'm just going to go side to side and just pull that green down to the bottom of the paper. And this is just going to give an illusion of, again, distance, because the green is going to be blurry, so it'll imply that there's some green grass or some green foliage in the distance near the feet of the mountains, or in the foothills of the mountains. So basically just light and airy layers will imply distance, and it makes your painting look more realistic. Alright, that's it for this section. We will see you in part 4. Alright, in this section we are going to be talking about the wet on dry technique, and we'll also be talking about the dry brush technique. Here in the beginning you're just going to see me sketch in a little road or a path, kind of just coming from the distance here. And if you're not good at drawing, basically all you're doing is kind of a long diagonal stretched out triangle that kind of comes from the bottom corner of the page here. Hopefully you guys can see that. But you don't want the lines to be straight, you kind of want them wiggly or kind of curved maybe. You don't want it to be like an actual perfect triangle with perfect sides. Alright, so basically the wet on dry technique is you're just going to be using wet paint on dry paper. And in this case we're painting over paint that has already dried. Some cases you'll do it where it's just a blank sheet of paper and you're going to put your paint over it. So there will be times where you do that. The color I'm using here is just a raw sienna color, so it's like a red-brown, like a brick red kind of. And you want a little bit less water, or quite a bit less water actually, than you would do for your wash technique. And this will just ensure that you're going to cover your wash, that's your background, so that kind of greenish area, we're going to cover that up. And this will just make sure that the layers of your painting will look more realistic if you use enough paint to just be able to cover that up. If this is your first time kind of using watercolors and you get it too wet and you can still see the green through and you don't like it, you can let it dry and then cover it back up. So here I'm grabbing a different color from the Praying palette, and the color in the Praying palette is supposed to be brown, but it's not brown, it comes out gray. So I'm basically just using gray here, and I'm just kind of dabbing in little spots and lines just to kind of give the path a little bit more dimension and some texture, make it more realistic. When you see like an actual path with your eyes, like out in nature, hiking around or wherever you're at, like your local park, it's never just going to be one solid color of dirt. There's rocks in there, there's minerals, there's debris, whatever. It's never going to be just one solid color. So here I'm just kind of adding that gray brown color. It's gray. Praying seems to think it's brown for some reason, but it's gray. So I'm just using that. And then here I'm just taking some white and I'm just doing some little tiny spots of white. So maybe it's wet outside, so the path looks kind of reflective, or there's some rocks in the road that are lighter than the rest of the stuff we're seeing. So that's all I'm doing. So I'm doing some dots of white in there, and here I'm going to make a couple of them, kind of lines, and this is all just to add different texture. And you'll see here in the next frame I kind of cover up those lines. I didn't really end up liking them, and that's fine. You could just cover it up with a darker color. So notice here that when we're painting on this road, we are also switching techniques. So we had been doing wet on dry, and now that the paint of our road is wet and we're going back over it with more paint, we have switched back to the wet on wet technique. This is something that's optional. If you want, you can do each individual layer as a wet on dry. So you could paint that first color of the road, wait until it dries, go back and add your details or whatever. Personally, as a watercolorist, I like my colors to kind of bleed together. So that's why basically I'm doing that here. Alright, so the next technique we're going to work on here in this next part is going to be the dry brush technique. Dry brush is basically you have little to no water on your brush and then very little paint. So I'm using the dark color that I used for the mountains in the background, but just a lot more paint and really no water on the brush. And here I'm just kind of going to do some some grass kind of textures in the background, a little bit in the foreground. Grass textures are great if you do like an upward, you see how I'm doing an upward stroke motion? That's how I like to paint grass. I think it makes it look fantastic, and you can see the texture just looks dry, and it's perfect for really rough, untamed shrubbery and bushes. So you can just kind of get in there. It looks very natural. It looks like you're out in nature. No one's out there grooming these bushes, so it's just a great technique. So here, as you can see in the background, I'm kind of smashing the brush into the paper. I am a horrible brush smasher. I buy cheap brushes on purpose because this will wreck your brushes, okay? This is not, like, a recommended technique is not to smash your brushes into the paper, except for me. I tell you to do that. Here I'm adding some water to make the paint go a little farther, because it would be, not that it's impossible to do, there's plenty of people that do this, it would be exhausting to try and dry brush that whole section with watercolor, because the paint doesn't go very far if you're dry brushing. If it were acrylic or oil, I would probably just dry brush the whole thing. But what you can do with watercolor is you can fill in your area with your dark color, and then you can always dry brush on top of it. So here on the other side of the road, I'm going to make it lighter. I kind of want there to be, one side is darker and one side's lighter. Like maybe one side kind of goes further into the distance, like there's less plants that live over there. So that's what I'm doing here. If you're wondering why all of a sudden I'm using less water, so the paint's lighter. And it's all about just adding layers and distance in your painting so that it looks very natural. So here we go, just doing some more upward strokes to create these grasses here. And you can continue on with this until you are satisfied with the way your grasses and your shrubs look. And I believe that's it for this section, and I will see you in the next part. In our final section, we're going to be just working on final details and discussing the project. So the first thing you're going to see me do here is I'm mixing a dark brown color just to be our tree trunk and our branches. So when you are drawing trees, you don't want to do what's called a lollipop tree. So a lollipop tree is like what you would draw when you were a child, just like a trunk and then like a circle top. You don't want to do that. You kind of want a thicker base with some thinner branches going up. I'll put an example of what not to do. You don't want to do this. This is a lollipop tree. This is what very young artists do. Now something more like this is perfect. This is what we're going for the trees in this video, okay? This is a great, easy tree to paint. All right, so if you watch me do this, you'll notice I do a thick trunk and then some pretty thin branches going upward. So you want more thin branches at the top of your tree than you do at the bottom of your tree. This will just kind of give it a more realistic look. You can do as much detail as you want or as little detail as you want with your trees. The brush that I'm using here is called a rigger. It's a really long brush that you can use for doing calligraphy. Actually, now that I'm watching it, I don't think that's a rigger. I think I may have just lied to you. Yeah, that's not a rigger. That's just a little teeny tiny round. But you can use a rigger. A rigger is the great big long skinny one. But anyway, as you watch, you can see that I am doing just some basic outlines. One trick I've noticed to do with trees is if you want it to be really kind of rough looking jagged tree, you can I sometimes will purposefully make my hand shake just a little bit to kind of give the branches kind of that natural, really crooked, jagged kind of look. So you're just going to want to paint in your trees the way that you see fit. You can do a tree like this, you can do a pine tree, you can do trees with leaves. I'm just going to do these kind of naked, dead looking trees. By naked I mean they don't have any leaves on it. So I'm just going to go with trees without leaves because they're a little bit easier to paint and they look pretty cool. So go ahead and paint in your trees the way that you want them to be. And then what we're going to do after you paint the trees is I'm going to go in using the same brush and I'm going to go back to the color I used to paint the grass, and at the base of each little tree I'm just going to kind of paint over the very bottom of the trunk just a few little tufts of grass, I guess you would call it, just a few little lines of grass there, just so that the tree doesn't look like it's kind of floating above the grass. You want it to look pretty natural and pretty realistic. All right, and we'll go to that point. All right, so here we go. We're going to add in our tufts of grass just at the bottom of those tree trunks there. I'm just using a nice dark color, so load it on the brush with very little water. I'm also going to just go in to that other smaller tree, do the same thing at the bottom of that tree. I'm going to add in just a few more lines of grass, just where I feel like adding them. And just like before, I'm just doing an upward stroke. You can dry brush for this if you want. Kind of give it that dry look to it. I'm also going to add a few bunches of tiny grass just there on the other side, and then I'll do a couple of little tiny ones in the road, so it just kind of looks like the grass is kind of growing out of the road a little bit. If you've ever been to the country, you know that grass just kind of grows wherever grass wants to grow. Any other details you want to add, you can. You could add more trees, you could just do one tree, you can do whatever you want to this picture. You can add little tiny dots, colored dots in the grass that could be little flowers if you want, little wildflowers. You could do a little animal in the road or hiding in the grass, whatever you would like to do. This really is supposed to be a project that is, it gives you free reign to create what you want while teaching you the basic techniques of how to use watercolor and how to apply it. Here I'm just adding in some little birds in the sky. These will just kind of help imply distance a little bit more. You don't have to do this. So I'm just using my little brush there, and I'm just doing your little standard birds that look like a little V or like a little stretched out M. Pretty easy. this painting good. Now here's the best part when you're taping down your watercolor. You get to peel off the tape at the end, and it has a nice white border, and it's just really rewarding to see. So I'm just going to peel this tape off here. It helps if you hold the tape parallel with the paper. I'm sorry if you hear a little voice in the background. I do have a little one that I'm trying to narrate with in the room, so please forgive me for that. Okay, let's talk about what the project is involving this painting. So basically the whole painting that I did, it's sort of a Bob Ross follow along with me style project. So as you're watching this video, you can paint it along with me and do it that way. Or you can watch the whole video, see what I do, and then you can do the project in the way that you would like. So the great thing about having this lesson be on a video is you can pause it and rewind it, and you can review it at your speed, basically. So that's why it's a great platform. Anyway, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoy the project and the lesson, and I hope to see you again.